The cycle of violence describes stages in the relationship that both perpetuate the abuse and keep the victim dependent on the perpetrator. It's a really useful tool in helping people understand the answer to the question, why doesn't she just leave? There are 3 stages involved in the cycle of violence. The first stage is the tension-building stage. The victim feels like she's walking on eggshells. Nothing she does is right. The perpetrator increases criticism of the victim. He's moody, he's unpredictable. She's constantly trying to appease him, but again, nothing she does is right, and so she doesn't know how to act or when the incident might occur.
If I would cry, or I'd be upset about something, or I'd be anxious, or I'd be trying to hurry up and get something done, or get dinner done, or whatever, he'd be like, at that point he was already calling him Daddy. He'd be like, is Daddy gonna get mad at you? Okay, Mom. Or he would actually try to help me do things so that he would be like, oh, here, Mommy, I'll help you so Daddy doesn't get mad. So I think kids are a lot smarter than what we think they are, even though they might not see something or whatever. And at that point I started feeling guilty because I didn't want my son to he shouldn't have to be worrying about stuff like that.
The next stage is the eruption stage, or the acute battering stage. That's when the violence happens. That's when the incident of domestic violence occurs. This usually includes a physical incident, but can also include a particularly severe incident of emotional or verbal abuse. The honeymoon stage is when the perpetrator apologizes and promises it won't happen again. The victim feels hopeful that the relationship will change. She believes his promises. He always says that it's going to get better, and so she really believes that this time he means it. The perpetrator will buy her gifts and take her out to dinner. He's very affectionate and loving, so the victim minimizes or denies the abuse and says, well, compared to all of this good, the bad really isn't so terrible, and therefore she stays involved in the relationship.
When that happened, he brought me flowers and we went out to dinner and stuff, and I remember when he got paid, he took us shopping and he used to do that anyways, but he never really said, hey, I'm sorry for what happened, but he was more of an action. He wasn't very verbal as far as like the honeymoon phase or whatever, but he would try to show me that he was sorry by buying things or taking us places.
After the first incredibly violent incident, she did not really apologize. It was not one of those relationships where she would guarantee me it wouldn't happen again, or she'd try and console me or try to win back my affection one way or another. She instead always justified it, validated it. She was more of less of a I'm sorry I hit you, and more of a see what you made me do kind of person. So it was always my fault, and I was the one who had to apologize for the behavior that caused whatever the violent incident was.
He never hit me where it would leave marks that were visible. He would always hit me in places where I could hide. Whether I wanted to hide it or not, it wouldn't be visible.
People had trouble believing that there were actual issues going on because I'd say, well, she hit me. Well, where? In the stomach. There's no bruise. There was nothing to show for it.
Domestic violence can trigger many different responses in victims. The one most people think of is all the physical effects, the broken bones, the bruises, head injuries, cuts, scratches, burns. But also many other types of chronic conditions can develop as a result of experiencing abuse. These things can include arthritis, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic pain, pelvic pain, ulcers, and migraines, as well as any kind of repetitive injuries that the victim may sustain. She might have more knee problems, she might have more back problems, anything that can happen as a result of repeated physical abuse.
It wasn't even that it didn't hurt nearly as bad physically as it did emotionally. And it just destroyed my self-esteem and destroyed my confidence and made me feel like I was 2 feet tall.
Among victims who are still living with their perpetrator, a great amount of stress, anxiety, and fear are commonly reported. Depression is also very common, as victims are made to feel guilty for provoking the abuse or causing it, and are constantly subjected to intense criticism. Victims of domestic violence can suffer very major problems with their self-esteem, since they're constantly getting told that nothing they do is right and nothing they do is good enough. It has been reported that 60% of domestic violence victims meet the diagnostic criteria for depression, either during or after the relationship, and they have a greatly increased risk of committing suicide or having suicidal thoughts.
She was so good at convincing me that I was worthless that I very quickly believed it. and spent a good portion of that relationship thinking that I deserved everything that she gave me.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is experienced by victims of domestic violence and is characterized by flashbacks of the abuse, intrusive images. They'll be doing something completely unrelated and an incident will pop into their head and they won't be able to stop it. Exaggerated startle response, they'll hear a loud noise and react to it much more quickly than other people would. Recurring nightmares about the abuse, and avoiding triggers that are associated with the abuse. Anything that reminds them of what happened. It could be a smell, it could be a sound, it could be a TV show. Anything that reminds them of the abuse, they're going to go out of their way to avoid that trigger. These symptoms are generally experienced for a long span of time, even after the victim has left the dangerous situation. Many researchers say that PTSD is possibly the best diagnosis for those suffering the effects of abuse, as it really does cover the full scope of symptoms that abuse victims experience. When a client discloses that she's been experiencing domestic violence, it's really important that you believe her story. Validate her feelings of ambivalence. Understand that she knows what she's experiencing is wrong, that she is deeply suffering from the abuse, but at the same time she's still involved in the relationship from her lack of resources, from the hope, from all the fear she's experiencing, and from love. Acknowledge that she took a really big risk in disclosing that she's experiencing the abuse. A lot of times victims can experience retaliation if the perpetrator were to find out that she told somebody that this is going on. Assure her that the abuse is not her fault, but do not blame her partner. Lots of times the victims are told that everything they do is wrong and that's why they are getting abused, so it's important to let her know that it's not her fault, that there's absolutely nothing she could do that would merit or warrant that kind of reaction. But don't blame her partner. Don't say it is his fault or he's a bad person, because you have to remember that she's still involved in that cycle of violence, that she's still involved in that honeymoon phase. And so if you blame her partner, she's going to shut down. She's not going to open up to you anymore. Finally, it's really important to respect her autonomy and allow her to make her own decisions. Don't decide for her whether she should stay in the relationship or leave. Support her regardless of whether she wants to stay with the perpetrator or whether she wants to leave.
You see other women that are in the situation, right away we start defending our abuser and saying, oh, you just don't know him, you just, oh, I upset him and that's why he acts that way.
The reason why it's crucial to assess everyone for domestic violence is because 1 in 3 women, statistics indicate today, will experience some form of violence in their lifetime. We have an obligation as a service agency, as clinicians, as friends, as family members, as sisters, that we pay attention to this if we are really truly interested in stopping the violence in the household.
I did go see a therapist at one point, and she didn't say I don't believe you, and she didn't give me any downright reason to think that I was lying to her. But at the same time, if I'd been a cute little girl that went in and said my husband is hitting me, or if our roles had been reversed, I can guarantee you that the amount of help and the amount of empathy would have been incredibly different.
The reason why confidentiality is important to the victim for their safety, bottom line, it can be a situation of life and death, especially at the point in time when the victim is leaving their abuser. Again, if we're looking at and recognizing domestic abuse to be a power and control issue, that's the point when the offender recognizes they have lost the control. And that is when it's most risky for the victim. There's also issues of stalking. There's issues of, even if the victim is living in the home, her seeking, or in many cases, when he is seeking assistance and seeking resources, seeking counseling, they're doing it secretively. And there's a huge risk of being found out, to be discovered. Again, things that we need to consider as therapists, as social workers, that internet, cell phones, leaving messages can all lead the offender to the victim, and we need to be very cautious and very mindful of that.